Hello everybody and welcome to part 5 of this breakdown of Spoon Graphics video on how to make something glow in Photoshop. As I'm looking at my photo here, I stopped the video and I came back to it a couple minutes later. I realized it's a little overdone. There's a little bit too much glow, it's a little bit too much neon. So how do you resolve that? This is a great problem that happens often in Photoshop, is that you've done something and you want to go back a little bit later and be like, yeah, it's a little bit too much. It's just a little bit too much. Maybe it's a little bit too much of a color. It's a little bit too turquoise, and you want to make it a little bit less turquoise, a little bit more on the blue scale. Okay. I wanted to share a couple of ways of resolving this. This is a really common problem that you need to resolve in Photoshop, is that you've done something and you want to undo it, but you don't want to start over again. This is why we work in layers, and why we work with adjustment layers and putting layers in groups instead of just affecting one layer. We can go back and edit it. So if you're working here on the hue saturation, you could try modifying the hue saturation. You can do that by double clicking here, or you could go up here to the properties tab, window I should say. Either one will get you up here. And so you could bring that saturation down a little bit. You could bring the lightness down a little bit. You could change the hue a little bit, right? So you could get more of a blue and less of a neon. And let's say you're happy with that. That works great. Another thing that you could do is change the opacity or the fill of the layer that you have here. And so you could just bring that opacity down, and at 75%, I think maybe that's a little bit better, right? So here's the hue saturation layer, and at 75% versus at 100%, if you just wanted to back that off a little bit, you could do that by changing the opacity. The fill also, we're going to see in our next kind of edit here, will also affect how much of the adjustment or how much of the layer that you have selected is actually coming through, right? So opacity and fill, both of these, in addition to the way that we've seen changing the blending mode can affect something, you can also change the opacity and the fill. So if you just wanted to, I like that, I just want to back off just a little bit, try 90%, something like that here for the opacity, and I think you're going to be happy with using those two things, right? You can always go back to the properties panel and then readjust something, and then you can also adjust the opacity and or the fill of that layer to reduce the effectiveness of that layer. Okay, so the next thing that Chris goes over in the video, he does a pretty good job of it, but the thing that I wanted to really bring to light here is that understanding light and how it works and how it will affect your subject as a photographer is really essential to doing something like this, doing an edit like this. Understanding how light works is really pretty critical to being able to create digital adjustments that look realistic, if that's what you're trying to do. And what we're going to do now is add highlights to the deer's head, ears, forehead, nose, and back. And then we're going to add some highlights to the rest of the scene. Because the effect that we're trying to accomplish here is that we're creating these antlers that are glowing, essentially creating light, well, we need to now affect other areas of the photo, and we need to sort of notice how the light would, if this were actually happening, if deer's antlers could glow, if this were actually happening, what's going to happen to everything else when you have this light source now on top of the deer's head? Well, what's going to happen is other areas are going to be brighter. We have kind of given the antlers a certain color glow, and so we need to give the highlights, or the areas of the deer and the rest of the scene that are going to have some light shone onto them from the antlers, it needs to match that color. So that's the explanation of actually like what's happening with this next step. Understanding light is critical, and this is one of those things I think that just experience, taking pictures, looking at light, understanding breakdowns of lighting studios, lighting scenarios, looking at other people's work that's well done. If you're looking for this particular thing, I think you can learn a lot from looking at other people's photos and from looking at your own photos. Observe how light affects the scene. All right, let's jump into it. So we're going to create a new layer now. All right, we're just going to create a blank layer up here. And we could call this, painted deer highlights. It's always a good idea to label your layers. We're going to grab the brush tool. Remember, the shortcut key is B. All right. One of the things that I didn't show you before is that if there's something in your way like this, my screencast recording is over here, I can just move my tools palette over a little bit. And then if I ever wanted to reset the palette, I can go to Window and then Workspace and then reset the workspace. I'm in the photography workspace, but I've modified it so I could always reset it and it'll just put everything back into that workspace. You can also create your own workspace here by moving things where you want and then say create new workspace here, and that will allow you to actually save. If you wanted a certain look for the way that you're working in Photoshop, you can set up your own workspace. So we're going to grab the brush tool, the B key, or clicking right here, and what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in quite a bit. Before I do that, I realized I actually want to grab the eyedropper tool. So that's this tool right here. The shortcut key is I on the keyboard. If you just hit the I key on the keyboard, it'll grab the eyedropper tool. And you can sample a color now. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, hand grabber tool to get up here to the antlers. And I'm going to actually look for a color that I think would be a good color to show the highlight here on the deer's head. So we're going to go ahead and click right there. And we've got a blue color here that I think is going to be pretty good. Now, when you're using the eyedropper tool, you can change the sample size right here, okay? And what this is, it's actually pixels. Point sample will take a single pixel, and if you click on an area, it's going to, whatever single pixel you're lined up with, it's going to sample that color. Oftentimes, I recommend using a 3x3 average. And what that's going to do, it's actually going to take 9 pixels square, 3x3, and it's going to take the average color of those 9 pixels. And oftentimes, for most photos, that's actually going to give us more accurate color for what we're trying to sample. Let's see over here. It's a little bit lighter when I go to the 3x3 average. And sampling here, sampling all layers is also important. And so, picking the right color, using the right sample, sometimes you want the point sample, sometimes you want a 3x3 average, 101 by 101 average. I don't know if I've ever used that big of a sample, but it may be that you will want to use that someday. So using these numbers here, choosing the sample size when you have the eyedropper tool to get the right color. All right, we're ready to start painting. So back to the brush tool now. And we're going to go ahead and get a much smaller brush. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more here. Much smaller brush. And I do think using and again, left bracket there. I'm using the left bracket key to make the brush smaller. But you can also go up here to the sides, right? And you can just kind of use your slider. I don't think a 0% hardness, and I don't think 100% hardness here. I think probably somewhere in the 30%-ish range for a hardness is probably going to be about right. Yeah, maybe actually, I'm going to hit Command Z to undo. Maybe a little softer. So let's go down. Yeah, let's actually go down to that 0% and go from there. So with this painted deer highlights, we want to reduce the flow significantly. We're going to go down to 20%. And, if you just wanted to type in 20%, you could do that. And turn our smoothing down as well. All right, that looks pretty good. And what you're going to do is build highlights by painting over areas here. Because the flow is reduced, it's not going to paint everything at once. So you build it up by painting over and over and over again. Now I'm using a trackpad. This is really one of the areas where using a Wacom tablet or something like that is probably going to be really helpful. Even using a mouse is really something I would recommend. If you have an external mouse that you're able to use for your edits, I think it's going to be really helpful. Now, don't worry about how it looks right now. We're going to change the blending mode and the fill of this layer to the point where we're going to be able to, I'm going to make a little bit bigger brush. We're going to be able to blend this with the underlying layer. Now, this is the part that I really wanted to highlight if the light is coming from the antlers, there's going to be a shadow under the snout or the nose, whatever you call that on a deer. Underneath here, there's going to be a shadow because the light's coming from above. It's as if somebody, you can actually see a shadow under my chin because I've got some light coming from above where I am. It's very similar to that. So keep that in mind. Zoom out a little bit, get a bigger brush, and I'm going to paint just a little bit, not actually a ton here. Brightening up just a little bit there. All right. Now we're going to change the blending mode and the fill amount for this painted deer highlight layer. The blending mode we're going to choose here is color dodge. Now that alone does not look good, but here if we start to change the fill, we're going to be in business. So let's bring the fill down to 0 and then bring it up 10% at a time, you can start to see some of that glow start to happen. You can also see when it gets too much pretty easily. And you can also start to see that my soft brush here has created this glow outside the ears. That's something I'm going to want to take care of. Again, what's too much? What's too little? 0%, not enough. Somewhere around 40%, definitely too much. 20 to 30%, I think, is right where we want to be. Let's try that right there, 30%. Now the great thing about doing this is actually now that the color dodge blending mode and the fill percentage is set, now I can actually add some painted I can layer on some paint using the brush tool on this layer, and it's going to paint the effect on as we see it here. So it won't look like it did before. So sometimes it makes sense to just do a little bit and then change the blending mode to the mode that you know that you want it to be. In this case, color dodge. Change the fill to the amount you know you want it to be. In this case, it's 30%. And then you can go back and kind of paint in a little bit. Let me show you what I mean here. So I think right here we want a little bit more. So with this layer selected, with this color selected, with the flow selected here, I think just a little bit more in here, maybe a little bit more back here is going to just get those highlights a little brighter. And then, like I said, I actually am a little concerned about the ears. They look like they're glowing. And so what I'm going to do now is actually erase some of what I've done. Okay, so let's zoom in, get in there to the ears. I'm going to get the eraser tool now. And my eraser tool, I think I want to be a little bit bigger. I think I do want a pretty soft edge, maybe not 100% or 0% hardness, but a relatively soft edge. And what I'm going to do now is turn my opacity and flow down. No, I'm going to keep opacity and flow at 100%. I'm going to actually just erase this so that that sort of halo effect isn't happening there on the ears. That doesn't really make sense lighting wise, and so I'm going to just erase the edge, and then I'll show you how to use the eraser, because I think the ears are kind of looking a little strange here. There's almost too much of the color that I painted in. Now I'm going to use a big soft eraser, so I'm going to go to 0% softness, so shift left bracket to get 0%, change the size a little bit, make it a little bigger. I'm going to use the right bracket to make it a little bigger. Now if I go to my opacity and I want to do, let's do like 10 or 20% opacity, 10, 20% flow. Now I'm going to show you a shortcut key whenever you're working with the eraser tool, the brush tool, any tool that uses the opacity and flow up here at the top. If you hit a number 1 through 0, it will set the opacity at 10% for 1, 20% for 2, and so on. So if I want 10%, I hit 1, and it jumps the opacity to 10%. If I want my flow to be 10%, I hold shift down and I hit 1. So I'll often be using those shortcut keys to change my opacity and flow. So in this case, I just want to erase the ears a little bit. So let's zoom out a little. And I just want to bring back some of the natural color of the ear. I'm just erasing at this 10% flow. I'm doing a little bit at a time. I think I've just done a little bit too much here from before. So that you can also look at the effect. I notice there's a little glow here, so I'm going to erase that real quick. You could turn that opacity up to 30% by hitting the 3, and then Shift 3 will change the flow to 30%. You can erase a little more here. You want to keep, I think, some of the defining shape that the shadow of the deer's face is sort of providing there. So here's before and after. We've got a little bit of too much here, so I still have the eraser. I can erase this a little bit before and after. So there's a lot of fine tuning whenever you're doing something like this. And you could go back now. I could go back to the brush and paint a little bit more on there. I can go back to the eraser and erase a little bit. And the result is, let's go ahead and just look at this layer by itself. If I option click, it'll show us this layer by itself, but because the color dodge blending mode, everything disappears. If I go to normal, it should show us a little bit more. It doesn't because the fill is actually turned way down, so that's okay. We can turn the rest of those layers back on. All right. The next thing we're going to do now is go ahead and do the same thing, but to the rest of the photo. So a little bit on the foreground, a little bit on the tree over here on the right. We'll go to part 6 of the video for that.